Well, welcome everybody. We are live on Facebook and on Zoom. This is the third in our Chebacco Chats episode, and we're happy to welcome Brittany Goetting to our studios. Brittany is a candidate for a PhD in history at the University of Maine. She teaches at the University of Maine and at Husson University. And she is a two-time author of Chebacco. She wrote an article in our religion issue last year, and this year she's written an article titled Committees, Churches, and Classrooms, Influential Women in Early 19th Century on Mount Desert Island, talking about two things in general, both what was the role of women in society before Maine statehood, and then the other interesting part of this, I think, is how does the historian go about discovering what that role was, and Brittany has taken on both of these things. Brittany, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And and maybe this is I don't think we have ever had a PhD candidate on Chebacco Chats.
I don't know. Yeah.
No, I'm sure of that. So tell us about your work as a student and a researcher, a historian, as a PhD candidate.
Sure. So my research primarily focuses on Baptists, but more generally, I guess you could say Protestants in northern New England and the Canadian Maritimes in the late 1700s to early to mid 1800s. And the reason that I focus on that very oddly specific time period and place and group is I'm particularly interested in the ways that people, particularly Baptists in my case, used things like print culture, so newspapers, magazines, etc., to form community and identity in a way that otherwise would not have been possible. So especially in this time, it's quite relevant looking at forms of asynchronous communication. So that's the general gist of my dissertation, and it involves looking at a lot of church association, meeting records, a lot of religious magazines, newspapers, diaries and things like that when I can get my hands on them, but a lot of the types of sources that I've also incorporated into this article.
And you have become expert in this research field of this wide-ranging field of religious-oriented literature from that period, and have managed to tease out the references to Mount Desert Island, which we really appreciate here.
Thank you.
Would you begin by reading a passage from the article that you've written for us?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is a passage that is in the introduction, actually the last paragraph of the introduction. And I write, though absent from many public records, women do appear in church documents and reports. These allow us to see how women responded to and altered their everyday circumstances and environments. Maine transformed from a Massachusetts frontier to a growing state during the 18th and 19th centuries. Locally, the community was enmeshed in these political, economic, and social transformations. Women were unable to participate in politics, but they were deeply involved in the religious, economic, educational, and social life of the island. Their impact extended outside of their homes, and their voices were heard through their participation in churches, societies, and schools. The history of women helps us to understand the development of the island and the larger trends that swept through the state and the nation.
So women, one of the reasons that the way you're digging into this is that women lived outside the realms of politics and business.
Yes.
And where traditional histories have often gone to find out what was happening, the newspapers and so forth. So where did you go to get the information that you've discovered about the role of influential women in Mount Desert Island?
Well, I did initially, just to kind of cover my bases, look through some of the more local and also international magazines, thankfully, or newspapers, I should say, excuse me. Thankfully, was able to access some online newspaper databases just to see what appeared when you typed in Mount Desert, and to make sure that I wasn't missing anything obvious. I also initially did start looking at some of the town records that are available through various local archives, and women very rarely appeared, which is what I suspected, but wanted to confirm before diving in. And so what I decided to do after that was to dig into the sources that play a role in my dissertation. So things like religious periodicals, various publications that were around during the period, because women were, while maybe not involved in, let's say, a town council or something like that, were incredibly involved in their churches and various community organizations in their neighborhoods and their communities. So for this particular article, once I ruled out the possibility of being able to dig into more traditional sources like newspapers and town records and things like that, I did start to look primarily at religious periodicals, meeting notes from various groups that were around in Maine at the time. And once you start digging in there, then you start to be able to piece together a much better image of what life was like for women during this period and the types of contributions that they made to their communities, both local, national, and international in some cases.
And you came up with an example of the contrast between what was available on women in the newspaper, for instance. And why don't you tell us about
so the two images you're about to see are an image of a newspaper, a quote from a newspaper that was published in 1789, and a quote from a magazine that was published in 2019. This particular newspaper article is talking about Samuel Hadlock, who committed a murder in 1789. But before committing that murder, he got into a very heated argument with his neighbors, including a woman who is named in the magazine Mrs. Manchester. And so the quote says, after some abusive language, he seized Mrs. Manchester by the hair of her head, pulled her out of doors, and threw her on the ground several times in a great rage. So this is one of the only, in fact, I believe in the newspapers that I looked at, it was the only mention of any woman from Mountain Desert Island. And it's in a very, we could say, arguably extraordinary situation. The other quote from the other, if we can move to the next slide, this is actually from Down East magazine, their October 2019 issue. It's their Where in Maine thing that they do, where they post a picture of Maine or somewhere in Maine. They give you a description and people, write it. And also, this was an image of Hadlock Falls. And I'm sorry, I'm saying that speaker is not working.
You're breaking up a little bit. I think you should just plow through. Oh, now your speaker's gone.
Is that better?
That's better.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you well, yes.
Oh, can you hear me, Tim?
Yes, I can.
Okay, all right. So go ahead and keep going. I think something got switched around in Zoom. So this was from, like I said, the 2019 edition, or October 2019 edition of Down East magazine. It's a description of Hadlock Falls, and in this description, they include a little bit about Samuel Hadlock, because this is Hadlock Falls. And in this description, it says, in 1789, he got into fisticuffs with his neighbors. A newspaper reported he had been drinking very freely and fatally smashed one of their skulls with a club. So the reason I wanted to sort of bring these two together is, one, I thought it was interesting, at least personally for me, that shortly after reading about this encounter with Mrs. Manchester, I then also read about it sort of in Down East magazine, but also to point out that even in a modern magazine, this story is missing. And that's not to say anything against the writers of Down East magazine. Both Tim and I probably know all too well the pitfalls that come with word counts and those types of things that you need for publications. But what it emphasizes is the need to dig into other sources, which is where things like religious magazines and newspapers come in.
So once you figured out that you had to abandon the newspaper as a source, right, you started to turn to to other areas of
right.
Churches and charitable committees and school. And yes, there you found abundant information. But maybe one of the things you can help us understand is what was the role? How prominent were churches and committees and schools in this era? Kind of a very different Mount Desert Island than the one we know today.
Right. So Mount Desert Island, as probably many people know, especially during this period, was very isolated, right? It was physically isolated. You had to get there by boat. There wasn't really another way to get there. And so because of that Mount Desert's relative isolation, which is so very different today, where, so many people know about places like Acadia National Park, things like churches and committees and schools really were the center of community on the island. Those are the types of places where not only are you going, let's say, for religious services or for education, but that's where you're going to connect with your community, because otherwise there are so few physical opportunities to be able to connect with your neighbors, community members, or even people traveling from abroad. There'd be visiting ministers, visiting, school teachers, speakers, things like that, who would come to the island. And so committees, churches and schools were the center of community. And even because of that, it allowed Mount Desert to not only maintain connections within the island or to the rest of Maine, but also to be able to maintain both national and international connections in a way that otherwise would not have been possible without these various institutions.
So let's take those one at a time, the
Right.
church,
Yeah.
community and school, and tell us about the role of women in churches, and your point being that these were not minor roles. These
No.
were central to community life and culture.
Right. So with churches, women generally comprise, and this is not just on Mount Desert, but this was throughout the United States during this period, women tended to be the majority of church membership. And while there is no evidence that any women served as ministers on the island during this time period or in those types of leadership roles that were typically reserved for men, they certainly had an impact on the structure and theology of their churches. And there's a variety of churches that are founded, including, we have here an image of Southwest Harbor Congregational Church, that were founded in the late 18th, early 19th century. And many of those founding members were women. And many of the members that break off to form new churches are women. And so there's a lot of theological influence that women had during this period through their choice of church and their involvement in church. There could also be ways to engage with helping to mold some of the behavioral expectations. So when you read a lot of church records, it'll say, oh, so-and-so hasn't been showing up, or they haven't been paying off their debts, or, they've been dancing, or I don't know, something like that. And they would send another member of the church, usually at first, to go talk with them, to bring them to the light, to bring them to reason. And there are so many instances in these records of women going to talking to other church members to talk to them about their behavior and expectations, some theological points, things like that. There are also some instances where church policies changed, because one example that's included in the article is Sister Olive Avery, who was part of a church and decided that she felt more comfortable with the Methodist. And we also see a lot of other people breaking off due to theological reasons. And it gets to the point in some churches, one church that I use quite frequently in this article and my previous one, the Eden Baptist Church, where they change their policy and say, we're going to be a lot stricter about who we allow to leave and whether or not we give them give them a blessing to go. So when it comes to churches, women can, even though they're not the minister necessarily, or a deacon, or in some other authority position, they can still yield quite a bit of influence due to these various structures within these churches.
And there was great intensity of feeling around these things.
Yes,
Definitely.
definitely.
Commitment to various doctrines.
Yes.
That must have been hot to handle in a community that's that's pretty small.
Well, and you also have to take into consideration too, during this time period, many ministers received their income from town taxes. And so if the head minister in your town doesn't have it doesn't follow the same theology that you do and you disagree with them, but your taxes are still going to them, that's going to cause a lot of tension. So we do see an instance of that actually happening on Mount Desert, where there is one minister who is a Baptist, and many coastal communities during this period tended to start with congregational churches. And there's quite a bit of debate over whether or not this Baptist minister should be the one to receive the income from the town's taxes. So there were obviously a lot of high emotions just due to various theological debates, but it also could get down to the nitty gritty, the very practical as well.
Yeah. So let's move on to committees.
Yes.
What do you mean by committees?
So when we say committees, or when I say committees in this article, I mean basically volunteer groups, voluntary societies, groups usually of women who get together and hold events, who go door to door to raise money for various causes that they are passionate about. As the image shows here, missionary societies were huge on not just on Mount Desert Island, but throughout the United States during this period. And there was a lot of money going into spreading Christianity, not just on the American frontier, but throughout the world. This is a little bit of a later example, and then this is actually from a 1819 edition of the American Baptist Magazine and Missionary Intelligencer, and it is referencing some of these various societies. So it says Eden, Maine, Baptist Feminist Mite Society, which is simply a society that is raising money for a cause. It's headed by Mrs. Joanna Hunting, who is the president of this society. She was the wife of Minister Enoch Hunting, and I think it's interesting that her name is so prevalent on there. There's others not of said society. So there are some women who are not associating with that society, but are still donating. And then the Mountain Desert Baptist Feminine Mite Society, or Female Mite Society. And this has Mrs. Mary Milliken. And of course, the Milliken family was pretty prominent on the island for quite some time. And it has, the various amounts. And like, for example, by the one by Mrs. Mary Milliken, that's $3. $3 in 1819 is no small sum. So they're raising a lot of money, and these are going to both domestic and international missions. So these various committees could band together, could have events, could just simply go door to door. I don't know, maybe a little bit of peer pressure was included in some of these situations, and end up using money to influence various causes that went even beyond the island, nationally and internationally. A lot of these missions, for example, were very focused on India. That was a huge topic during this time period.
Yeah, and the time just flies by. So
it does.
Let's get to schools.
Right. So during this time period, women were increasingly becoming teachers. It's hard to imagine in 2020 that there were not a lot of female teachers, but that's actually something relatively new. So prior to this period, teachers had primarily been male, not just at the college level, but also, I guess you could say, K through 12, although they didn't have the same concept of K through 12 that we do now. And so women, through their ability to teach students, in some cases their say in or their input into maybe what curriculum could be selected, although ultimately that was usually chosen by a town minister or somebody like that, could wield immense influence over a young person's life outside of their immediate family. So schools and becoming a school teacher was another way of influencing, another way women could influence their community. This is, of course, newer picture. I mean, I meant newer compared to the topic of my article, but there are multiple kids, and female school teachers would have been responsible for teaching roughly from 4 to 5-year-old children to about 8th grade, roughly. And would have taught multiple children at once. Schools were not divided by grade level like they are now. So this is kind of a good picture that illustrates the variety of children that would have come to these schoolhouses during the period.
So, Brittany, what you're telling us is a very different history than perhaps one that we've dealt with in the past, where focus a lot on men in the community.
Yes.
As male leaders, and you are bringing a new sensibility to our understanding of what Mount Desert was like. Help us put it in context. How were the roles of schools and committees and churches
Right.
elevated from where they are now?
So I feel like in 2020, schools and churches and these various committees are something that were, in some ways, we kind of take for granted as having always existed in our communities in one way or the other. And certainly some of them do not wield as much influence as they do or that they did in the past. And I think a strong example of that is churches, particularly what is referred to as mainline churches. So Methodist denomination, Congregational, Presbyterian, etc. But during the late 18th, early 19th century, as I mentioned before, these were the hubs of the community. Many people, theology was something that was heavily debated, where your money went either to churches or various missionary, or I should say voluntary projects, was something that was up for argument and was a big deal. So like, right, at the moment, a lot of churches engage in missionary activities, for example. That's something very common in 2020. This was just getting started in the late 18th and early 19th century. And so the women on Mount Desert were able to say, this matters to us. And we believe that we should be able to raise money and send that money to the causes that we believe are the most important. So it was there, even though they were not able to, run for town council, or they do not show up in newspapers or town records or things like that, they're still able to wield quite a bit of influence through these various institutions. And these are very much cultural hubs as well, right? This is where books were not all that common on Mount Desert during this period. And so you were most likely going to get a book, for example, from a school teacher or from a minister or from one of these organizations. So they were cultural hubs, they were social hubs, and in some ways could be economic or political, depending on how you look at it, especially in the cases of when money is exchanged, right? When money is being sent to various institutions. So it's a little bit different now, where I think we take for granted that these institutions have been here for quite some time. But two, some of these institutions are not nearly as influential as they once were, or their influence has changed slightly. And these institutions were very much a way for women to have leadership roles and in ways that they would not have been able to. So it was significant for them, I think, on a personal level as well.
We have a question from
Yeah.
Dad Roberts. He asks, did any one religion dominate on MDI?
Well, and yeah. That is maybe perhaps look at the previous, I'll give a little plug, the previous edition of Chebacco. But in all seriousness, so most coastal towns in Maine, if there was a church, there would initially be a congregational church. And some of the first churches, and of course I'm talking about English settlement. I'm not even going to dig into French settlement and all of that happened in the century prior. But with English settlement, it primarily would have started as Congregationalist. But as Maine expanded in the early 19th century, we start to see other denominations for a variety of reasons we unfortunately time-wise can't get into today, including Baptist, Free Will Baptist, Methodist, and we see that religious diversity on the island during that period. So like I mentioned earlier, the case of whether a Baptist minister should be the one to receive the taxes, that was a big debate, and that was because there was quite a bit of at least Protestant denominational variety on the island, particularly in the early 19th century.
So early on, what was the highest membership in the late 18th century?
Yeah, so early on, the church that would have had the biggest membership was probably the Congregational Church, Southwest Harbor Congregational Church. Quite a few people end up splitting off to form the Mount Desert Baptist Church, the Eden Baptist Church, and then people split off from those to form other churches. And those churches' populations really, they swelled sometimes and then went down at other times. So it would have probably started off as congregational, but once we really get into about 1805, 1810, And then really, once we get to Maine Bicentennial, there are many Baptists, quite a few Free Will Baptists, and others on the island as well.
So I want to invite anyone in our audience to send us a question. If you're on Zoom, to ask us a question on Q&A or via chat, or if you're watching on Facebook Live, we've got a little bit of a delay there, but ask us a question, just put it right in the comments. And in the meantime, Brittany, what is your next project?
Finishing my dissertation.
Tell us what your life is like as a graduate student studying for your PhD. What has your educational journey been like, and what do you see ahead?
Well, right now I am focusing on finishing up as much archival research as I can. Of course, with the recent pandemic, a wrench has been thrown in many of those types of plans. A lot of archives that are typically available are closed right now. So what I've been doing or trying to do is focus on a lot of those online resources, a lot of that I reference in the article, things from archive.org, have been really great resources. So I'm trying to finish that up, and my goal is to get writing hopefully very soon. But in the first few years of my PhD, of course, PhD students take various classes that influence ultimately what their dissertation is going to look like. And I defended what is referred to as my prospectus, or essentially the outline of my dissertation, as well as the list of sources that I believe I will be using this past fall. So I'm very much in sort of the end stage, the end game.
Good for you. Now questions are starting to come in.
Okay, excellent.
So could you tell which of the most prominent women on MDI gained their prominence from their own strength of character and achievement versus those who were the wives of prominent men?
That's in many ways kind of a tricky question, because a lot of the women that I'm looking at are involved in these various committees, and because of sometimes their husbands standing in the community. So as a minister, they were granted those leadership positions, right? So in the case of Joanna Hunting, she is the spouse of Enoch Hunting, who's the minister at Eden Baptist Church for some years. And so a lot of, I don't know this for certain, of course, but I believe that a lot of the reasons that she's listed as president is because of her overall status in the community. Oh, it looks like we lost me. One second.
We have to have you on audio at least.
Let's try that again. So anyway, the answer to your question is, I'll move this a little bit. We're going to my other camera.
You're fine. You're fine. We can hear you and see you. It's fine.
The answer to your question is, that's a little bit difficult to say, because some of those women wouldn't often appear. There are some women that are listed in church sources. For example, I mentioned earlier Sister Olive Avery. She was not she wasn't married to a minister or any prominent person to my knowledge, but ends up having an immense effect on later policies of these churches, because she ends up leaving a church and then a bunch of people kind of follow afterwards. So we see some cases in that, but a lot of the women, of course, that we see primarily in these magazines, for example, are connected to ministers and other authority figures.
And then we have a question. I think this is from Gary Stelplug.
Okay.
Can you say anything about nurses, midwives, or other medical roles?
I was not, so I'm guessing this is coming from Laurel Thatcher Ulrich's book, Midwife's Tale. Unfortunately, I was not able to find any record of that kind of thing on Mount Desert. Certainly there would have been, I'm sure there was midwives or women who at least, midwifed on the side or something like that, but I unfortunately wasn't able to find that type of documentation.
I do know that we have a good series of letters from Emily Savage during the Civil War era, providing in detail how she cared for her brother-in-law as he was dying of tuberculosis, and reports on all the people in the village who were sick.
Right. I don't think we have anything. There's nothing earlier, though, unfortunately.
I don't know of anything earlier.
Speak to the Civil War, but not necessarily the early Republic.
Yeah. Well, our time flies by, which is the way we any other way. Brittany, it was great having you on.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for joining us. and for all the work you put into Chebacco. This issue of Chebacco has been received by people in our immediate era. I know it arrived in your mailbox, Brittany.
It did, yes, my copy here.
All right, great. So if anybody listening, if you live outside of our area, it's probably still on its way to you. If you are not a member and you would like to get a copy, just check us out on our website. It's an easy place to find out how to get a copy at mdihistory.org. And next week we have Eric and Daniel Schenkel talking about the history of their farm and Wabanaki dispossession. It should be a very interesting conversation with a father and son research team, Daniel and Eric Schenkel. So please join us next week, 4:30 on Thursday, and we'll look forward to that conversation. Brittany, it's great having you on. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Take care, everybody. Take care of each other. See you soon.